yeah, which is a big provider of actually security management. Yeah, so somebody who prevents your website from being attacked. Now, they did an update, something was wrong, and all of a sudden a lot of websites weren't reachable anymore. So nothing that the companies themselves did wrong, but had they done a proper risk analysis, they would have said, well, I'm dependent on CrowdStrike, because if something goes wrong with them and if they prevent all traffic coming to me, my website is down. I can't do anything. So I actually need to manage that risk a lot better. I need to manage it as my own risk. If I'm a provider of a web shop, I need to make sure that my data center or my cloud operations are running. I can have SLAs in place to make availability clear, but I could also have a second cloud somewhere so I can switch over. If I then have a service like CrowdStrike, I need to very clearly understand what if something happens to CrowdStrike and all of a sudden my website is not reachable anymore. I'm losing tons of revenue. So what do? Can I switch over to a different provider? Can I turn off CrowdStrike, which would probably not be a very safe thing to do because then would be prone to security incidents. But those are things you need to think through. And what DORA wants from the financial service industry is to think about that. And to think about all of the little changes that happen, because we're not only in a project or change-driven world. Those are the things that we as testers are typically influenced by. We look at requirements, we look at software changes, we look at things that are happening somewhere. But at the end of the day, that's not everything that happens. Just look at this here. For example, somebody in the infrastructure team did a vulnerability scan. Yeah, so they scanned the production or the test environments and tried to find weak spots. And they realized, oh, on my Linux installation, there is some weak spots, I need to patch it. So they go to their Linux provider, they download a patch, they install the patch. If you're lucky, they tell you that they're installing this patch now. If you're unlucky, you don't even know about it. And look at this chart, the patch of the vulnerability scan, you're actually in the middle of the change design, so okay, that's not a big issue. If you learn about it, that's good, because then you can make sure that your test environment is also patched to the same level, so that you test against the same configuration as it would run in production. If you're unlucky, nobody takes care of the test environments, and all of a sudden you might have an issue because you're testing against version A, but in production you already are running version B of your Linux. Now, the next stuff that could happen is there could be a disaster recovery test. I mean, it's good practice to run a disaster recovery test. So what if there's a big flooding? What if there's an earthquake? What if anything that can happen, power outage or a fire in your data center if you're not in the cloud, but even if you're a cloud service provider, there could be a fire happening there. What if we need to shut down a whole data center and ramp up the next data center and switch over to there? So that's a typical disaster recovery test. So somebody would start that and on the one weekend, run in the new data center, so switch off the old data center, run in the new data center for a week, and then switch over again. What if that happens while you're doing your build, your unit test, and your system test? Again, you would be testing in an environment that is not the actual production environment. Now, that might be an issue, it might not be an issue, we don't know. Yeah, but we need to know, we need to be aware of that. And then, for example, the security team might have the great idea, let's run a regular penetration test, an outside ethical hacker penetration test. And DORA actually has 2 out of the 4 articles that have something to do with testing. 2 out of the 4, the 50%, are for security testing called threat-led penetration tests, which means I need to think about all the risk scenarios that I have, and I need to build up teams that test against those security threats. Now, if the security team has read DORA, they will say, hey, this is a great idea, let's do it. Well, what happens if they do it in the middle of system integration test, and all of a sudden your systems are down, because they found a weak spot, and they then started fixing something? What if they fix something while you're doing your acceptance test? Again, you're testing against a configuration that will be different once you hit production. So actually your test is invalid. And there are a lot of those small things that could happen. Configuration changes, normal cloud provider updates, and so on. So the run activities that you see here is really just a small glimpse of anything that's happening every single day in your company. We only typically look at the application layer, but there are monthly Windows patches, there are monthly SAP releases, there are Salesforce updates, and. And what DORA says is, let's combine this. Let's make sure do this again. Let's make sure that we actually talk to one another. So similar to DevOps, where the development team knows what the operations team is doing, let's talk to one another. Why don't we schedule the regular infrastructure penetration tests at the beginning? Yeah, so that if we find something, we can fix that early enough so that before we actually run the testing, we have updated all of our test environments. Similar to the patch after vulnerability scan. Let's make sure there's an information to the testing team to say, hey, by the way, we have patched something. Can you please update your regression test to make sure every application that's running on a Linux machine, that is actually tested? And then you say, okay, sure, no, not a problem. I have automated this. I can add some additional tests to my regression test bank just to make sure that whatever you have patched, I'm also running. Maybe we'll move the disaster recovery test a little bit earlier so that we're done and we can test in the actual test and production environment again. And DORA also explicitly says, hey, testing is not the only thing in quality assurance. Make sure you have requirement reviews, make sure you have code reviews, make sure you have performance tests in there. And at the very beginning of the slide, the red diamond that's at the beginning is at the heart and center of DORA. And basically every regulation out there, but also in TMMI, in TPI Next, in ISTQB, whatever method you find there, it's always about risk analysis. Because testing is risk management and risk mitigation at the end of the day, nothing else. We test in order to find defects, but also in order to tell management, tell people who need to deploy stuff, how much risk there will be with this deployment. So at the center of all of this is always, let's take a look at the individual demands, let's take a look at all of the infrastructure and run activities, identify the risk. What happens if I run my monthly Windows patch at this point in time? Well, it could impact my testing, it could impact my test environments, so why don't we do it, but then we run some automated tests to make sure nothing has happened. How much regression testing you do, DORA doesn't say anything about that. That's still your risk appetite. That's still also in TMMI, your decision to say, well, if it's the Windows update and I actually don't run as much Windows, I have a lot of Linux, then I don't need to do as much, or only systems that are not critical are really impacted, then I don't need to run as much regression testing than if I impact critical and important functions. Again, there's a whole methodology around that, but we as testers need to be involved in there. And TMMI is really all about that. It's about understanding the risk and tailoring your test approach to that risk, and that's also luckily what DORA says. Now, let's take a look. So I talked a little bit about the current situation. I talked a little bit about what does the testing world actually look like and why do we need to improve testing processes. What does TMMI give you? Well, TMMI was designed to look at a whole lot of different models, take expertise from the industry, and look at all kinds of leading practices from all kinds of practitioners, but at the end of the day, cover everything that has to do with testing and quality. So within TMMI, you'll find peer reviews, you'll find requirements reviews, and you'll find a lot of different things with the aim that this is a model that's easily understood. So if you as a testing practitioner, if you go to tmmi.org and you download it, and by the way, it's for free, you will easily understand that. There's no rocket science in there. It will tell you how to write a test strategy. It will tell you what is important when I do my test planning, what is important when I think about test environment requirements, all of those things. It's easy really to use, and it can be used globally. By now, it has been translated into, I don't remember, 8 or 9 different languages, and it's really an open standard. So everybody can become a member of the TMMI Foundation for free. Everybody can actually work in these working groups and make the model a lot better. Currently, we're working on release 2 of the model, which takes probably another 1.5 years to be ready because this is all volunteer work, and we want to make sure it's safe and sound. But it should really be a standard process model so that everybody can use that. There's also one small thing that is maybe interesting in your industry or not. It's supposed to be complementary to CMMI. Yeah, so TMMI, Testing Maturity Model Integration, from the wording, it's very similar to CMMI, the Capability Maturity Model. So we follow a 5-step scale, and the format and the structure is similar, but it focuses only on testing and quality assurance. Why would we do that? This is, of course, something where at the end of the day you can get a certification. You can certify to the world that you're a level 3, level 4, level 5 organization. And many companies do that. In some countries, it's actually regulated. Yeah? So if you want to do business with the government, you need to be a level 4 and level 5 organization. But in most countries, it's voluntary. So we did some surveys, and most people say, I want to either enhance software quality. There are issues in my software quality, and I want to look at the end-to-end quality assurance and testing process to find out where are those issues, or I want to increase productivity. Now, like I said before, business capacity is always scarce. There's a lot of people who really don't have time for this or not the understanding. I want to get better. And fourth, but not least, we want to reduce product risk. So increasing quality, reducing risk, that's all at the heart of TMMI. There's a lot of other things in there, but it's not about cost reduction at the beginning of the day. It's really about making your quality and testing practices better. Now, how did we actually build that? Yeah, the TMMI Foundation, like I said, is a not-for-profit organization. It's open, everybody can join. And at the end of the day, the principles were we wanted to build a unique model, and there has been research that shows that TMMI is most widely used now globally. So it has gained a lot of attention. It's not yet nearly where I want it to be. I want everybody to use it because it's a great model. You can clearly see the evolution of testing. It needs to be robust, but it also needs to be pragmatic. And there were several sources used with the aim that no single source is more important than others. Yeah, so we looked at all kinds of different things, but this was almost 20 years ago now. 2005, 2006 was when it was established. Yeah, so it should be an independent framework. Yeah, and like I said, this is just repeating. None of these sources is more important than others, and the most important thing, we want to be recognized globally. Yeah, so we have 61 countries right now, roughly 29 local chapters, which means individual chapters like the Turkish Testing Board, who said, hey, TMMI is important. We want to have a TMMI chapter in Turkey where we can do some marketing, we can translate that, we can offer assessment courses, we can offer trainings and so on. But you see, it's really used globally. In some countries more than in others, that's normal. Yeah, but that's why I'm also speaking to you. I'm driving it in the German-speaking markets, for example, as part of the TMMI Foundation, and we want to make sure that everybody knows about it. Now, the aim is very clearly, we want to have an international standard. It needs to be in the public domain. We want to have some kind of data repository, so that I can see how many people have been certified, how many people are at which level, and we want to offer some kind of independent process so that if you want to run assessments within your company or as a service provider for your clients, that you're accredited, which means that you follow a similar process. So that if I see that company A is certified level 4 in, let's say, Germany versus Germany 4 in Turkey, then I know they're roughly at the same standard. It's at the end of the day still a process model. Yeah, so it's not a checklist. It's not an ISO audit where you can say, do you have this, do you have that? No, it's an interpretation. It talks about if you want to have a good test strategy, you need to do this, that, and the other. But then it's up to the assessor to understand whether that fulfills the expectations of TMMI of the model or not. Yeah, so it will never be a checklist where you can simply, if you take your car to the garage, they check 20 things off and they say, okay, now you're ready to go again. No, this is still interpretation work. Yeah, but at the end of the day, there's an accreditation process. You typically start as a TMMI professional. And then either you go the route of assessments where you want to provide assessments, you can become an accredited assessor, and then a lead assessor, which allows you to do the things on your own. Or you go more into consultancy. This could be in-house consultancy or external service provision, and then you're a test process improver. And so TMMI Professional is really the certification to get started, to understand TMMI really well. There are a lot of courses that are available for this. You can do them online. You can go do that on-site. Just look at tmmi.org or the Turkish Testing Board to find out more about that. Now, I talked about DORA, and I talked about the convergence of all the change-driven testing and the non-function testing or the operations testing. How does TMMI actually support that? TMMI is put into 5 different stages. So it's a 5-scale model. We start at the initial level, And then you have 5 process areas at the level 2, which we consider managed. So TMI thinks about change management in terms of you reach one stage, and once you have reached that, like the foundation, if you want to build a house, then you can continue. If you haven't done the foundation, you probably shouldn't build the walls or the ceiling or the roof or anything else. It will fall down. So let's start with managed level, which is really the basic testing processes. It talks about test policy and strategy, test planning, test design, test execution, a little bit of test monitoring, so the test management layer, and test environments. That's the basis. And there's nothing really special in there, but if you start reading the TMI model, you will realize there's a lot of good stuff in there that you might not have realized on your own. It then goes to level 3 defined, level 4 measured, level 5 optimization. And I'll walk you through some of these things to give you an idea how does that fit into the world of DORA and how do you actually improve your processes. So let's take a look at that. At level 2, like I said, basic practices. But then again, look at your company and think about how many of you really have a test policy. So a policy that mandates how testing should be done within your company for everybody, including all of the change-driven testing at the application level and all of the infrastructure operations type of testing. And if you have such a policy, that's great, but is it actually being lived? Is it being followed? Or is it a piece of paper or some kind of PDF that's somewhere on a website and nobody really cares about it? Think about it like the email policy that you might have in your institution, where you're allowed or not allowed to use your company account for private emails. People are looking at that, they're regulating it, they're monitoring it, and the similar should be with the test policy. Test planning talks about the estimation. So it talks about, have you estimated, have you planned at a risk-based level that during your testing phase, something else at the infrastructure level could change. It talks about the need for test design and execution. So how do you design your tests? And we know this from IS2QB, but how many people are really using that for proper test design? And how often don't you just take the requirement, you think about some tests, but you don't create the whole decision tree, equivalence classes, edge cases? I know we don't always do it, even though it's best practice. And then last but not least, and this is what is front and center in DORA, we talk about test environments. So how do I make sure that I know in the environment that I'm in, I'm testing the right stuff at the right level? How do I create requirements? Now, in closing, level 3 is where things really get interesting. Level 3 is the so-called defined level. Now, defined level means that testing is not just the phase after development. Testing is fully integrated into the software delivery lifecycle, which means it's not only testing, it's also quality assurance. And testing starts as early as requirements definition. Somebody does a review of the requirements to make sure they're testable, they're accurate, they're complete. Somebody does design inspections, somebody does code reviews. And if I do all of that, how does that link up to the later testing stages? Like in my example before, if I do these requirements reviews, I should change my test approach. If I realize these requirements are not stable, I should test more in that area than in other areas. Which means there's something like a test organization. Again, think about DORA, independent, sufficiently skilled people who actually know how to do this. There's a test asset, there's a process, there's a training program for these people. And it's integrated. So the processes, whatever you do during unit testing, directly impacts what you're doing in system integration testing. Moreover, non-functional testing, performance, security, usability, and so on, that's actually also integrated. It's not some security testing guys doing something and you don't know about it. No, this is actually front and center, and this is part of your planning. You as the test manager for your application, you know that there will be a penetration test, and you know what to expect, when it is, and you will take the results of that, the patches of that, incorporate it into your testing. Same with the performance tests that are being run regularly. And last but not least, there's a new process that talks about how do I actually do this? How do I actually make sure that we do proper peer reviews at the requirements level, at the design level, at the coding level, at the test level, who actually reviews your test cases, and so on. So to put it all together, TMMI gives you all the tools that you need in order to not only implement DORA, but you take your testing from the traditional model to the Champions League, or in our little race car analogy, from something that you built yourself to a proper car that you can take you to the racetrack. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you have a great remaining evening. For any questions, please reach out to me, either via the Turkish Testing Board or via tmmi.org. And I wish you a very pleasant and very healthy weekend. Bye-bye.